رادیونا افغانستان یگانه شبکه تلویزیونی ملی افغانها در خارج از کشور.
السلام علیکم. بازم خوش آمدید در پروگرام دریچه فردا، پروگرام برای جوانان و نوجوانان. انشالله امروز گپ میزنیم درباره شیولری، مردانگی یا فتوات. انشالله یک پروگرام خوش براتون انشالله یک پروگرام خوش داشته باشیم. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Mason Latif. We have a great program for you guys today, inshallah. Welcome to Dariche Farda. Today we're going to be talking about chivalry. Chivalry is other known as manlyhood, or in Arabic, futuwat, inshallah. So the concept of chivalry was something present amongst the Arabs, even in the days of Jahiliyyah. But Islam refined and emphasized it. It was very apparent in the Crusades with Salahuddin and throughout Moorish Spain, and that concept permeated throughout European culture. As Muslims, we reflect back to what Prophet Muhammad ﷺ taught us, and through his actions, we can only learn more. And chivalry also goes to respect for women, and so on. And today, inshallah, we have Imam Marc Manley with us here. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Imam Marc Manley was born in Detroit, Michigan, and embraced Islam in 1992. He subsequently learned and then taught the Arabic language for a few years. Imam Marc has a passion for writing and educating. His writing has been recognized through a number of venues, from the Philadelphia Inquirer as well as the Best Design in the 5th Annual Brass Crescent Awards. Imam Marc has taught Islamic Studies at Crescent Academy in Canton, Michigan, and has previously held roles such as being the Drexel University and University of Pennsylvania chaplain. He completed his ijazah at Quba Institute in the area of khutbah. He has served as an imam at the Islamic Center of Inland Empire, and in addition to his religious duties, he consequently worked full-time at the School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania in IT and instruction technology fields, and maintains his popular blog at www.marcmanley.com, which is down down below. So we're very honored to have you here, and thank you so much for coming, Mama.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so to begin to kind of talk about it a little bit, so as I said before, the today's topic is the importance of chivalry for youth in today's society. So why is chivalry so important for youth in today's world?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulih al-kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. I think first is to kind of unpack the word chivalry. So when we were talking, right before the show, I kind of laughed a little bit just because the word chivalry in the English language kind of takes us back to kind of European fairy tales. And what we're really talking about in this religious context is really behavior, right? We're talking about certain attitudes or behaviors that young people should have. The word that you're using, that's I guess both in Arabic and Farsi, its root is futuwa, and interestingly enough, it shares the same root actually as the word fatwa, right? We all know the word fatwa means like essentially a religious opinion, right? Being able to know perhaps 2 or 3 sides of a particular topic, and then being able to, if you were like a qadi or a judge or a faqih, right, you could make a opinion. So I think it's interesting to see it as not necessarily we're talking about young people becoming like knights from 1,000 years ago, or even like, Salahuddin Ayyubi, of course, a great Muslim from history, but to bring it forward in a time and place where people could kind of put their hands on it. What does it really mean? Essentially, we're talking about like behavior, like how is it that young people, should behave today? And there's, to kind of maybe set the tone, there's a famous hadith that's narrated by Ibn Abbas in which he's actually with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he's riding with him, and the Prophet says to him, "Ya ghulam, oh young man," right? Kind of like "oh boy" or "young man," because Ibn Abbas is very young, and he says to him essentially, "Ihfadullah," like which is interesting to say, like almost preserve God, right? Preserve Allah. وَيَحْفَظْكَ. And if you do so, then God will sort of preserve or protect you. So like protect or preserve your relationship with Allah. And if you do so, then Allah will protect and preserve the relationship with you. And I think that's a good jumping off point if we're going to talk about behavior or certain attitudes that young people should have today is one, it has to be Allah-centric, right? It should be like a God-centric, being sort of, keeping your mind on, that everything that you do, like your actions are recorded, right? And that you will be held accountable for what you do. And I think that's perhaps, for me, like as imam, when I do a lot of counseling with young people or families come in and they're dealing with young people and their family, a lot of it is behavioral issues. And the young man or woman that's having the trouble or whatever that it is, they're essentially not behaving in the way that they would like. Now, some of those things are cultural expectations. So depending on where you're from, whether you're Afghani or Syrian or Turkish or whatever, right? You may have your sort of cultural expectations, but then we also, as Muslims, kind of generally have our religious expectations of how young people should act. So to take it back to this idea, the root of futuwat is to be able to have an opinion or essentially to know your circumstances. I think in order for young people today to behave correctly, a lot of their behaviors is they get into circumstances and they make bad choices, right? Mm-hmm. They start maybe hanging out with the wrong group of people or start doing, and then they perform actions around those people that leads them into trouble. And I think part of I don't want to keep using that word chivalry, but of futuwat or futuwa, the singular, is that we have to give young people, I think, like a really proper education that is religious, but also is in tune with the culture that they're going to live in. So if you're here in America, it should make sense to you, especially if the youth here perhaps. I mean, for me, it's different. Like, I'm a convert, right? I became Muslim almost 25 years ago. So I come from a kind of a different culture. But I see a lot of times there are these divisions between the older generation and youth. And sometimes it's just a thing of like there are different ages or the different times they come from are conflicting. But I think overall, like, if you want to start talking about behaviors, then in a way that's not so complicated to understand, but sometimes it can be challenging to implement, because if you live, like if you're living in Europe or you're living in America, where the predominant culture or society you live in doesn't necessarily reflect your values or your religious assumptions as a Muslim, that can be a challenge when every time you step outside your house or you step outside the masjid, you see a different reality. And that's where it becomes important to actually be able to formulate your own kind of fatwa, right? From futuwat to fatwa, meaning that, okay, when I'm out here, I need to be able to make a decision that I either do this or I don't do this, or being mindful that, if I do this, it may lead me into this, which could be problematic, or if I do this, it's, it'll be fine, and I can lead a good life and have fun. So I think a lot of it is, to break it down in a way that is not abstract, is we're really talking about trying to teach young people to make good decisions that they will see, not that mom and dad will get upset, right? Because I understand, like when I was young, doing things I know that my parents might be upset about, that was a pressure. But eventually you get to an age where that may not be the number one consideration as you become an adult, right? That might not be. And that you want to teach them when they're young that, the decisions that you're making today, even if you're 13, 15, sometimes when you're that young, you feel like you'll stay that age for forever. and then suddenly you're my age. You're like, wow, like I'm suddenly in my middle 40s, and I feel like I was 13, 2 weeks ago. Meaning that the actions that you do today, they will come back to you, right? And sometimes not in too far in the future or when you're older, and just trying to get the young people to understand that, what you do has real consequences. Consequences doesn't always have to be like a negative thing, right? Consequences mean like what you do today. Like if you go to school and you get good grades, the consequence is you could go to a good school, right? So consequence doesn't always have to have a negative connotation, but if you go to school and you do all kinds of stupid things and you don't study and you come out and you don't get good grades, well, maybe you don't get to go to a good school, and maybe that will have impact on the level of education and then what kind of job you get, right? So it's really, I think, trying to show young people that their actions, good and bad, have consequences, and that, I think, will help develop a healthy mindset of how to process the reality that they're going to go into and the society that they're going to go and be a part of, and be able to live fully as a Muslim. I think if there's going to be any of this sort of chivalry type of thing, part of it has to be that it's to lead to a good life, right? I think particularly for young Muslims today, sometimes they feel like, man, Islam is just this burden, right? It's this list of don'ts. There's only like 5 things you can do, right? Shahada, Salah, Saum, Hajj, Zakah. There's only 5 things you can do, and everything else is haram, right? And begin to see that, just behaving as a good person. Now, we can go and talk about particular instances of how the Prophet ﷺ acted or how the Arabs acted, but I think what the interesting point you brought up about this idea of futuwat or futua coming from even from the Jahili period, even from the time before Islam, it goes to show that every culture has essentially an idea of what constitutes good and acceptable behavior. Meaning that you may not find actual, like a great list of actual instances of what it means to do futuwat. That you may actually have to look into your own culture or even into your own self, and then just simply compare and contrast that with what are the major things that the religion doesn't allow, right? So we live in America where drinking alcohol, for instance, culturally it seems like almost as normal as drinking water, right? So we don't drink alcohol, so we say, in that instance, that's something that we don't do. But that doesn't mean that we can't enjoy. Like, I love coffee. I'm a coffee addict, right? So I drink coffee. I love it. So you can still live a good life. And my hope, from this discussion, inshallah, that we'll have today is that the takeaway that somebody listening, like a young person listening, or a parent, listening that is thinking about how to deal with like a young person, their family, is that the takeaway should be that performing these futuwat or this kind of good behavior, it will lead to leading a good and fulfilling life as a Muslim, right? And that it will help to in some ways alleviate this mental burden of thinking that Islam is something that's just not fun.
Yeah, that makes sense. And like you said before, when you kind of talked about fatwat and how it's rooted in fatwa, before we kind of go on, I just want to kind of define the dictionary definition of it. And like you said, the whole idea of, you might not like the word chivalry, but I mean, it has that like.
As an American, it has. I think perhaps particularly as an American, the word chivalry just invokes like King Arthur.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, like Knights of the Round Table, that kind of thing, which is admirable, but just perhaps a bit ancient.
Yeah, exactly. Like the dictionary defines it as like knighthood, bravery, courtesy, honor, something like that, gallantry towards women.
Right.
But I think for us in Islam and in the Prophet's time, it kind of goes beyond that because. During the Prophet's time, obviously there was many stories, and we'll talk about that later, inshallah. Hadith, like the hadith you said, that kind of shows the manlyhood and young manlyhood of the Prophet and the Sahaba at the time. But so going off of that, like how was chivalry practiced at the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam?
Well, it's interesting that Islam, when it came to the Arabs, right, when the Nabuwah, when the prophethood was given to Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in some ways, it was countering certain assumptions that Arab culture had about what was good, right? So the Quran brings is what? Stop bearing your infant daughters, right? Because that was a practice that they considered to be okay, and yet the Quran overturned that. And then there were other instances, particularly the idea of what we, in Arabic is termed karama, or like hospitality. That was something that the Prophet ﷺ made use of and didn't really have to tell everybody exactly. So the point I'm trying to get is that a lot of what constitutes the futuhat, very little of it is directly articulated from, you could say, either the hadith literature or from from the Quran. A lot of it was already assumed to be, this is how you should be. And then in particular instances where, again, it was something that was negative or contradictory, either the Prophet deliberately said, no, okay, this is bad, you shouldn't do it, or the Quran deals with it in some particular way. Mm-hmm. So one interesting aspect is that, particularly when the Prophet had to make hijrah, right, from Mecca to Medina, and the way that he was received by the Ansar, and part of that was their futuwah. Mm-hmm. Like part of that was kind of like the idea of hospitality and treating him well and looking after the traveler, even in the way that even the pagan Arabs, right? I mean, Mecca was known. The Quraysh were who? They were the carekeepers of the Kaaba, mm-hmm. and they were responsible for feeding, for providing water to the people, either Hajjaj. Even the Hajjaj, the people that would come and make tawaf at the Kaaba, even before Islam, their charge as the carekeepers of the Kaaba was to provide a level of hospitality. Now, some of that wasn't always just altruism, because they know, well, if we don't do this, then people won't come here and they won't do trade, right? Because that was the main thing. But that even goes to show kind of the intelligence that Islam has, is that, okay, even if the pagan Arabs were motivated, say, by economic reasons because they wanted to make money, in the end, it was a good thing, and it, over time, created a culture of hospitality. Mm-hmm. And when the Prophet came, he didn't change that, right? He changed, don't worship the idols, right? But he didn't change, like, okay, everything's got to go. Like, we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Mm-hmm. So my point is that, again, you can go and look at all the particular instances in which either, like, certain Sahabi dealt with somebody, or the way that the Prophet ﷺ dealt with somebody. But what's really beginning at is that the Prophet utilized Arab culture, mm-hmm. right? And I think we have to, if we were to translate that and bring that forward in the time that we live in, right? So we live in America. One thing that Americans, like non-Muslim, whatever, one thing that Americans really appreciate as a culture is hard work, right? Mm-hmm. We have this kind of like cultural myth and narrative of, the person that works hard and is earnest and whatnot. I mean, that's obviously completely compatible with Islam. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I think we should utilize that in a way, because, when our kids go to school, they interact with non-Muslim kids, right? I think we should tie into those narratives in the same way that when the Prophet came to Mecca to preach, he didn't just say, okay, we're going to get rid of all this, everything that came before, mm-hmm. We're going to get rid of everything before that. No, I'm going to keep what works, and I'm going to try to hopefully polish what may be so-so, and a few things, yes, we'll have to get rid of. Mm-hmm. So it's actually, it's a level of intelligence that goes beyond just a laundry list of, well, this is what you can do and this is what you can do. I think it's going to take a level of, courage and intelligence on Muslim communities wherever they're at. Again, whether you're in Europe, you're here in America, Australia, whatever, is to, kind of look to those things in your society that are at the level of sort of like cultural narrative. And if they don't contradict the religion, then it's something we should kind of embrace. And an easy example, and when I was at the Islamic Society of North America, ISNA, mm-hmm. they had their big convention in Chicago a couple weeks ago. So I met this guy who, he's like a Muslim Boy Scout troop leader, right? So this is like a great example. Now the Boy Scouts is like, if you want to call it modern day chivalry, right? Modern day Knights of the Round Table, whatever you want to call it, right? The Boy Scouts would most certainly be the modern incarnation of that, right? And one of the reasons why he really advocates and has had great success with the youth through the Boy Scouts is because they do all these activities that are, I don't want even to say manliness because they also work with the Girl Scouts, so I don't know if you want to call it womanliness and then manliness. So I mean, the interesting, I mean, Futua, if that means really to be kind of, young, that's part of what it means. So it's meaning that it's not gender specific. But he has great success with this because they do all this kind of like fun activities that, you learn how to like survive in the wilderness and build a fire, and you do all these things and you get badges, and it builds character, right? And the young people doing it, they feel good, they have a sense of independence, and they feel accomplished and whatnot. And they reinforce, right? You have to be honest. Like, you shouldn't tell a lie. You should try to do community service. Like, you can get a badge. Like, if you go to the homeless shelter and feed some people, or you go to the retirement home and you help service like elderly people, you get like a badge, right? So when you're coming up in this, when you're like 8, 9, I went through it 8, 9, 10 years old when I was in the Boy Scouts, you feel good. So in that same way, I think we have to create some kind of what we haven't done as Muslims, I think, in the modern age, is create some kind of system of reward that reinforces what we want from young people, that will reinforce the behavior that we want. So if we want young people to be honest and truthful and upright and hardworking and respectful, and like the list goes on, all those things from the prophetic period, from the time when the Prophet ﷺ lived, we have to create some kind of modern system, I think, of reward. So, there's a great instant from the prophetic period where there was a battle that took place in which the Muslims fought, and they won, and they got some of like the stuff from, they call it booty, right? They got all this stuff from the other side. And the Prophet gave it to these people who were kind of like new Muslim converts. And some of the Ansar were like, well, hey, what about us? Like, we took you in and we've been going through, we've suffered. He's like, they get this material stuff, but you guys get me. And then you'll get me in Jannah, right? That kind of thing. So a reward system that is meaningful to the people, that encourages them to participate. So when the Prophet ﷺ said that to the Ansar, they're like, bet. All right, we get to live with you, and then we'll, inshallah, be with that. That was convincing enough for them to keep up the system of being good Muslims, right? So in the modern sense, we have to have some kind of, we have to have the creativity to come up with some kind of reward system. I'm not saying we all join the Boy Scouts, but it has to be something that incentivizes young people to want to behave that way. Because what we realize is that on the reverse, right, when young people don't behave as they're supposed to do, right, they're actually being incentivized to behave in the other way, right? So whether it is, drugs or this or that, right, they're being incentivized from the other side. So we have to see that as parents or imams or, the older people, we have to incentivize the youth to want to do this. Almost kind of like, I hate to say it, like almost like market capitalism, right? In terms, we have to compete in this social environment, and we have to realize we have people that are selling things that are very attractive. And if we want to get their attention, we have to make it equally attractive and incentivize them. I know this is a little abstract. I haven't given any particular, concrete examples, and partly because I don't have them all myself. It's something that hasn't quite been done yet. But I do feel that our community needs to give this serious thought, right? And I say that as somebody, as imam, of a masjid, on Friday night, you have to understand, man, if you're, I became Muslim when I was 19, right? So I know what Friday night means, right? I know what Saturday night means. And I ran into conflicts with some of the masjid elders because my idea was Friday was like, let's just have a barbecue at the masjid and let people just kind of like have fun, right? The problem was the older people were like, oh, the young people are making noise. That's what young people do, right? Young people make noise. Trust me, I have a 4-year-old. All she does is make noise. So we have to, in this conversation, what I'm trying to say at this part of this will also be changing the mindset of the older people to allow the young people to be incentivized. We're going to have to maybe rethink our commitment to certain, cultural norms of, young people are just quiet and this, And if most of us are honest, if we think back when we were young, we weren't that quiet, right? We weren't that, right? But you become older and you become kind of set in certain ways. But no, I think one really important way to make this successful, of getting the people to do these things that we think of as, again, like, good behavior and being respectful and all, that has to be incentivized. And I say that because I don't see that really happening on a broad level in our communities. So we need some intelligent and creative leadership in the community that can inspire young people and incentivize them to at least provide them really good alternatives to some of these other lifestyles that are out there.
Yeah, exactly. Like you were just saying about incentivizing. A lot of times, like, I'm in high school, and we have this, like, our school has this, like, integrity, honor, social responsibility. Like, they have it everywhere. They have signs, and people that, like, you think it's just a saying, but, like, like you said, in American culture, you talked about how in the Prophet's time that was very widely known and stuff. But, like, in American culture, especially, like, as I've been growing up, I've been in public school my whole life, and I've seen what that sort of means, and, like, that personal satisfaction you get with being that with being, like, not manly, but young and mature, and having that honesty or integrity.
Right.
And so yeah, I've seen that a lot, and I think it's something very highly regarded in our society today. But listeners, inshallah, we have the phone number is down below, so you guys can call us with any questions you guys may have for Imam Mark, or any comments, questions, suggestions. So please give us a call, and we'll be sure to pick them up. So to kind of move on, we talked about futuwa, but like we were talking outside before, we talked a little about muruwa. So what's the difference between the two terms?
Yeah, well, I mean, muruwa literally means to be a man, right? So there's a common name that the Arabs used to give their sons, which was Marwan, right? So my last name is Manley. So if you were to literally translate my last name into Arabic, it would be Marwan, right? So Maru'a means to be a man. And there actually is a thing called Muru'a, which is kind of like another version of, futu or futuwat, but it is particularly focused on men. And in that way, so another example from the time of the Prophet ﷺ is that when he had to make his hijrah, right, Ali went to lay in his bed, right, so that, because they looked so similar, right, so all of the people from the Quraysh, the different tribes, they wanted to kill the Prophet, but they're like, well, we don't want it to be any single one of us, because otherwise it could be this retribution. But if we all, right, kill him at once, then there's no way that they can blame one of us. So Ali ibn Abi Talib, agrees to be in his bed, and the Prophet and Abu Bakr, right, they make their way. So as they're making their way through the desert from Mecca to Medina, which nowadays we think, like, what's the big deal, man? You just hop on the bus and, like, an hour and a half later you're there, right? Back in the day it was definitely very, very different. It was much more difficult. So they needed to rely upon this one particular man who I think Ibn Hisham in his Sirah lists his name as Abdullah, but there's some difference of opinion of what his name was. But the key thing is that he was not a Muslim, right? He was actually a pagan. He was a mushrik, but the Prophet had a particular objective, which is, I've got to get out of here. I've got to go to Medina because I have to continue the message, right? So whether my guide is a Muslim or a non-Muslim at this point doesn't really matter. I just need somebody that can do the job. So he approaches this guy, Abdullah, And essentially, the way that he convinces him to assist the Prophet to make the journey is kind of like almost how I can imagine today you go to somebody who's like a tough guy and be like, yo, man, I need your help because I heard you're the man. Like, I heard you're the dude. Like, nobody's better at you than this, right? And the guy is kind of like, yeah, I am the man, right? So he kind of, like, as we would say today, man to man, right, talks to him and makes use of this muru'ah, right? This manliness between men of like, come on, dude, like, buck up or whatever. So he's like, yes, my reputation is on the line. I am the best tracker. I know all the secret ways through the desert, blah, 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 blah. So, the Prophet ﷺ makes use of this cultural thing going on, which we would call manliness, right? It's not like mufakhara, like boasting, but it might have a little bit of that in there. But nonetheless, it was this cultural thing that he made use of that was not explicitly defined or detailed by Islam. So the Prophet here, even though we know that the Prophet ﷺ has the isma, right? He is infallible in his interpretation of religion. At this point, he's not like, Jibreel isn't like bringing him revelation about this. It's just the Prophet's own knowledge of his own people and their cultural norms and making use of it to accomplish a good goal. So that's in some ways so that would be like a good definition of the difference between muru'ah and futuwa. Some similarities, but really again, because muru'ah literally means to be a man. Although it does have the feminine component, so the word for woman in Arabic is imra. So maru'ah, imra, so the female version of it. But when you say maru'ah, this is talking about kind of literally like manliness, or if we would say in today's English, like dudeness or something.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, that makes total sense. Like, a lot of times manliness, like you said before, is something kind of I've as I've grown up, like, I've kind of taken it. There's different forms of manliness. Like, of course, like, I grew up thinking manliness was, there's a narration. I'm not sure where I heard this, but I think it was Umar radiallahu anhu who was asked, the true manliness is found in the strength of holding up back your tongue. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, and even if it isn't, even if we don't find a particular, maybe it's like an athar or something, but the whole point is, let's just say we find this tradition. Before we even get into investigating the science of the sanad and this and the rijal of it and all this, right, the narrators, just what does Quran say, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu ittaqullaha wa qulu qawlan sadida. Oh, you who believe. We hear it like in the muqaddimah, almost of every khutbah on Friday. Generally, the imam will read these few ayat from, that typically used from the Quran, where Allah says, oh, you who believe, ittaqullah, right? Have taqwa of Allah, and what? Wa qulu qawlan sadida. Speak a straightforward word. So this kind of goes back to this. One, we truthfully have to engage the Book of Allah. Like, we really have to read it in a way where we understand it kind of what I would call like from a 10,000-foot level, right? Meaning we understand the broad message that's coming from the Book of Allah, the broad message of its morality, the broad message of its ethics, and therefore, and I'm not discounting the need for certain religious sciences like hadith science. Like, that's very true. If you're a muhaddith, or if you're in the business of, particularly if you're trying to use a hadith to make a law out of it, right, then that becomes very important. But if you find that, I don't know, like Abraham Lincoln said that, the strength of a man, okay, fine, I can use that because it's supported foundationally by what the Quran is saying. And I think this kind of apparatus is what we find the Prophet doing, what we find the Sahaba doing, even after the death of the Prophet. That's in some ways, that's how all the religious sciences developed. Because once the Prophet ﷺ died, we didn't have anybody that we could go to and say, okay, we need to know A or B. And if the Prophet says A and didn't say B, then it ain't B, right? Or vice versa. But as we know, life is like many, many, many shades of gray. That's how you had essentially usul al-fiqh and all these other sciences developed because we ran into things where, okay, well, we don't have any particular instance of either there's an ayah that specifically addresses it or there's a hadith that specifically does. So we had to come up with a system of trying to gauge the spirit of what essentially the deen is about, right? So I think, that's an instance of, I'm not saying that we don't try to verify. Is that actually like what Omar said, or who was the narrator?
Yeah.
That is important. But my main perspective is if you're trying to use that as a means of encouraging me or encouraging young people, right, to be earnest or whatever, then use it. I mean, because regardless of whether Omar said it or not, radiyallahu an, it is backed by what the Quran talks about, right? So I think part of this is also what one of my teachers, Dr. Sherman Jackson, talks a lot about, the need for religious literacy. So if we're going to try to, inculcate or teach people this sort of futuwat or this kind of whatever you want to call it, chivalry, manliness, godliness, whatever that you want to call it, part of that will have to be done by giving young people a really solid religious foundation that goes beyond memorizing the Quran. Because in my experience, I've taught kids Quran in various Islamic schools, and their behavioral problems are not because they haven't memorized the Quran. Or I've even seen kids that memorize the Quran and they have behavioral issues, right? Part of it is they can memorize it, but they still don't know what Islam says. They still haven't developed a very good apparatus of, once I step my foot outside the masjid, once I step my foot outside mom and dad's door, I'm going to have to be able to make good decisions on my own.
Yeah, and I wasn't completely sure, but it makes sense, obviously. So to move on, inshallah, we're gonna take a quick call, and yeah. Assalamu alaikum, Dariche Farda, you're live on air. Hello, assalamu alaikum. Okay, we'll just go to the next one. Assalamu alaikum, Dariche Farda, you're live on air.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
I'm calling from Toronto, Canada.
Maple Leafs fan.
Yes. My question is, when you're talking about, being a man and having courage and being true to the teachings of the Prophet, what do you think about social media and our young men and women, Muslim men and women using social media, Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, everything, and they portray themselves differently in social media or school, and when they come home, they're a different person. What is your solution for parents in this regard of social media?
That's a really excellent question. Yeah, Jazakallah khair. That's a very excellent question. I think social media challenges us in ways in which are kind of unprecedented, right? If you think about it, even the time that I came from, just 40 years ago, it was very difficult to have another version of yourself that doesn't really exist, but yet, right, you use it all the time, and it can be very covert and in a way that's very unaware of your parents' scrutiny and whatnot. It's a really good question. I think the way to combat, or not even really, I shouldn't say combat, because if we take the idea that, okay, social media has to be combated, meaning that essentially it's got to get rid of, the reality is it's so ubiquitous, meaning it's so used everywhere, we're not going to be able to stop our children from using social media. I just don't see that as just from a logistical standpoint, I don't see that as really plausible. What we have to, again, do is teach our kids in a way that, one, again, everything that you do is recorded. So Allah is Allah, whether I'm walking down the street or whether I'm Snapchatting, right? That the angels, right, to the left and the right are going to record, katibin. They're going to record what I'm doing, whether I'm typing in pixels on my cell phone or whether I'm having a conversation with you right now on the phone. it doesn't really matter. And I think that what this really signifies, and this is where, again, we as the adults and the imams and right, we have to think hard about this, because what it illustrates is that somewhere along the way, and it's understandable, this thing kind of took us by surprise. Like, it just kind of cold clocked us, like, out of nowhere, this way for our kids to have this life that we just don't really know about. We need to kind of play some hurry up defense, and part of the instruction that we have in our Sunday schools or whatever that it is, or dinner time at the table with your kids, is you are you. There's only one you. In the way that we say La ilaha illallah, right? There's no God but Allah. There's La shakhsa illa ant. There's nobody except you, meaning that you're the same person online and offline, and that you should carry yourself, that Allah will be just as displeased with you if you made fornication in real life versus making fornication online, right? That if you lie to somebody in the street, you probably would be less apt to maybe do that, but you'll lie in this kind of fabricated identity that you have online. So the idea is to show that our kids that there actually isn't a separation. It's an illusion that this is a separate life, right? That the reality is that this is all one life, and that when Allah says, وَقُولُوا قَوْلًا سَدِيدًا, speak a straightforward word, or ittaqillah, right? Be mindful of God, that kind of thing. That applies to pixels as it applies to reality. The sad part is the very little about this subject that gets talked about that I've seen from other imams, so I'm being critical of my own kind of personal community of imams, is it's all negative, it's all negative, it's all negative, it's all negative. And I know that when you start talking that way to most young people, it's kind of like that cartoon I used to watch as a kid, Charlie Brown, that whenever the adults would talk, it was like, wah, 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 right? Just like you didn't, they just, okay, I'm not even listening to you anymore. I think what we should do is like have, activities at the masjid or some kind of thing where you encourage people to engage in these things, like engage in Facebook, social media, whatever. Like let the imam Snapchat. Like I've tried to have a very strong social media presence as imam, just to demonstrate that, you can do this thing in an earnest way. And that, if your thing is about trying to deceive Allah, then you'll be just as deceitful in your real life as you would be in your online life. And then what's the folly of that, right? That you can't really fool your creator. And therefore, I think having those kinds of earnest conversations, but I mean, this is everything from the mimbar, from the khutbah, from the halaqah, to the dinner table. I mean, I think parents have to engage the young people and their family at the dinner table and have these kind of honest conversations with them, and like, hey man, the person that you are is the same person no matter where you go, even if it's in this, online virtual reality world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jazakallah khair for the answer. And for me especially, I'm involved in social media as well, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. But it's just about besides using it in the right way, using it at least in a way that you're not creating a double life, and that's obviously a constant struggle. So moving forward, inshallah, we talked about this futuwat for ourselves, right, and in the Prophet's time. But how about using this humility as a roadmap for societal cohesion, like for the society around us? Before that, we're going to hold that thought real quick and take one more question, inshallah.
Sure.
Assalamu alaikum, Dariche Farda, you're live on air.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm calling to ask what specifies futuwa in manlyhood in regards to other aspects of human being, like being brave, being charitable, give zakat, sadaqah, and all those other aspects. What distinguishes futuwa in manlyhood from these other aspects?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so you got that question, right?
Yeah, what distinguishes, right?
Yeah, so before we go on, we're just going to take one more, so the lines keep going. Assalamu alaikum, Dariche Farda, you're live on air.
Walaikum assalam. I'm calling from Istanbul, and I really, really liked your show. Thank you so much for having Sheikh Marc Manley on the program. I have a question, actually. I just want to first make a comment and make a question. The topic that you guys chose about chivalry and manliness, it's so crucial and important, I think, more maybe now than ever before, mainly because I think men and women are raised differently in a Muslim household. So I don't really know, maybe it's like that in all of the Middle East. I'm saying Muslim, but, it could be like any culture or any religion. But I think the topic is so important, but I wanted to, if possible, if you guys could backtrack a little bit and talk about just how parents raise their sons and how they're not really taught to be a man and how to become one and how to change from that, like transition from boyhood into manhood until their son gets married. And then I feel like the wife is the one that has to kind of, take over and start talking about how to become a man, and it's so much harder and so much so difficult rather than parents doing that. So I just wanted to kind of ask that question as to how, what advice would you give to, because a lot of parents also watch the show. I'm watching the show with my parents, but they also, like, what advice would you give to like the whole family and especially parents and even sons in this regard?
Okay, Jazakallah khair.
That's a great question. I'll try to go back to the first question, which was asking specifically about examples of like bravery and whatnot. I mean, I think again we often fall into the trap of looking for specifics, but there's a great verse in Surah Al-Rahman where Allah says, "Hal jaza'u al-ihsani illa al-ihsan." Is there any reward for excellence other than excellence, right? And I think instead of looking for particular examples, because as I've said, you will really kind of only find a few of them, and the most important thing is just be excellent, right? I think having courage is very important. I actually talked about this a lot lately. So and this will tie into actually the second caller's question, that if you want your child to be courageous, then you as a parent are going to have to be courageous yourself. You cannot expect your child to naturally, some sort of like rationalist point of view, like Robinson Crusoe or something, right, just become brave. Children naturally are first going to imitate who? Their parents, because that's the example that they've seen. So one of the examples, one of the conversations I had when I was actually at ISNA in Chicago, and I said, I don't want to beat anybody up over the head with like religiosity, but I said just as a simple example, right? And I don't mean this to be fuddy-duddy, but if you're a guy, like if you're a father, if you want your son or your daughter, but your son to grow up and to be courageous enough to be Muslim in a society where most of the people aren't going to be Muslim, my recommendation to you is to grow a beard. Now, this may sound like, what are you saying? Like a beard is going to solve all your problems? No. What I'm saying is have the courage as the parent to be visibly Muslim and to be proud of being Muslim. And the easiest thing for most guys, I understand there's some people that can't grow a beard, but a lot of us, like if you're from Afghanistan, 99.9% chance you can grow a beard in a day, right? So, I was like, how can you expect your child to be courageous when you move to America or move to Europe or move to some other part? And I understand you don't want to necessarily stand out, but again, that sends other kinds of psychological messages to the young people that, well, I want to take the easy way out of everything, or I don't want to be distinct, or I hate to use the word cowardly, but in some ways, if you really want your child to be courageous, then you had better best show that to them yourself. Now, courage isn't what Hollywood always tells us that it is, a good guy versus a bad guy, or running into a burning building or whatever. I mean, sometimes it's just as simple as being unapologetically Muslim, which doesn't mean you're like throwing your religion in people's faces and you're being a jerk about it, but at the same time, like you're like non-apologetic about what you believe and you're proud to be what you are. So I think, for the first caller, that we have to go back to a way that we actually inspire our children. I come from an age where I think that, we wanted to be like our fathers because our fathers were great men. Now it's funny, like I'm almost 6'5", 270 pounds. My dad is like 5'6", 140 pounds. Don't ask me what happened, right? But nonetheless, my dad is like the opposite of me. Like I'm very extroverted, big guy, deep voice, all this kind of stuff. My dad's like a little guy, quiet, but my father worked really hard, right? I mean, my father worked really hard to provide for his wife and 3 kids. We grew up that we felt that we were loved. We felt there were people that, were a person of value. So I have tremendous respect for my father, especially now that I'm a father, right? That I look and say, man, if I could be half the man that my father was, I would be a good man in this life, and I think that's what we have to as parents see, that we can't look to the imams to inspire our children, right? Because to be honest, when you come to me as an imam, I'm a stranger to your child. Like when you bring your kid in my office and like my son is doing this or my daughter is doing that, they're like, man, who's this dude with a beard and this? I don't know this guy, right? They know you, right? There was a guy came to me a couple of weeks ago and he said, brother, I'm having an issue. My daughter came to me and she wants to marry this non-Muslim guy. And, I told him, well, he has to convert and this and that. Could you talk to him so that he can know everything about Islam and he'll convert? And I said, well, man, you got a bigger problem. You have a parenting deficiency in yourself, in that if your daughter has been dating or whatever with this guy, this non-Muslim guy, for how long, like a year or two, and you're telling me that in 2 years, this guy doesn't know anything about Islam from your daughter who's supposed to marry him, there's something wrong with your parenting between you and your daughter. And I can't come like a mechanic and fix it like, oh, you just got a flat tire here, let me just take this off and put this on and fix it, right? And there's people look to the imams to be like that. Like, I'm sorry, like, your parenting at some point failed. If you want this to be successful at all, you need to go and have a different relationship with your daughter so that she can feel confident enough to share her Islam with this person, right? So, I mean, this is like an interesting kind of example. I think for the second caller, I think it goes back to we have to be inspirational. When we look to the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, we clearly see a man beyond even just the topic of fatwa or muru'ah, right? I mean, the Prophet was incredibly inspirational, right? That's why when they fought at Badr or Uhud, the Sahabi were willing to literally jump in front of him and catch an arrow. Why? Because he was incredibly inspirational. If you want to be the parent, like, look at him. I feel like our children don't know that we really love them enough. Like the Prophet was very much with his children. Now, he didn't have any male children that survived to adulthood, but if you look at his daughters, the ones that survived to adulthood, he was with them, right? Aisha was asked one time, how was the Prophet with his family? And she said, he was in the service of his family. So the Prophet ﷺ, even though he had the great burden of having to deliver the message of Islam and teach all these people and whatnot, he was still a family man. Like, he did chores around the house and he was with his children. He would, even when he was praying, like there's this great hadith when the Prophet ﷺ was praying, and when he would go into sajda, like Hassan, they would climb on his back and they would be playing and laughing. And he said, I would sometimes extend my sujood just so that they could play a little bit longer. And then he would come up or even, they even interrupted the khutbah one time. Said, Hassan came and said, this is going to be that he's a Sayyid al-Arab. He's like a Sayyid, like a leader amongst the Arabs, meaning that he's going to be a great man one day. And he was in the middle of delivering Friday khutbah, and he's a little kid. He just comes up and he stepped down off the minbar, picked him up, kissed him, put him back down, came back up, meaning that he was present. You know, like we say, I think particularly like in Urdu or maybe even Farsi, when you refer to somebody as a great person, you call him, hadra, hazrat, or hadra, right? And, so hadra in Arabic means what? Present, right? So when we say like Hazrat Ali or Hazrat Umar, or that means a person who's present. So the way to do it is to be present in your kids' lives. That means that you may have to renegotiate what your life is all about. If your life is only about earning income, and I understand, I moved to Southern California. It's super expensive to live here. It's crazy. I understand the pressures of bills and sending your kids to school and all this other stuff. But there comes some point where I know that, you know what? If I don't give my daughter love and attention, and then inside of that, woven inside of that, instruction and so on, she's going to go get it from somebody else out there. And the other source that she gets it from might not be so great, right? So you have to be your own hazrat. You have to be, muhadir, like you have to be present in your children's lives. Because again, there is no imam that is going to have some sort of like Harry Potter hocus pocus magic solution to, the ills that are facing your family. And I highly encourage Muslim parents to reassess the values of their life, the time that they spend with their children, and what their demeanor is like. Like I learned very early on, even though my daughter is only 4, if my daughter sees me angry, she reacts very, very viscerally to it. So I make a point, like when I wake up in the morning and I see my daughter, I smile as big as I can. I'm very affectionate with her, and I see like it totally changes like my daughter's demeanor. And I think, we need to really think about the psychology that we're developing with our children. Maybe all this talk about chivalry and behavior, maybe it's as simple that some of our kids don't feel as loved as they should, So I think that's another area that we should really look to. And this is sad because I think traditionally, Muslim cultures from, Arabs to Afghans to Turks to Africa, wherever, right? Indonesia, Malaysia, were very, very family oriented, right? And I think we're losing a little bit of that in the modern age. And we need to kind of pump the brakes a little bit about maybe some of the sacrifices that we're making in this life and ask ourselves, what's the return on the investment? And are we making good investment in our kids?
Exactly. Jazakallah khair, Imam Mark, those terrific answers. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. We have to end the show here. We have a few calls, but we have to conclude the show, inshallah. You can check out Marc Manley's website. It's down below, www.marcmanley.com. You can email him through there. So, inshallah, please ask us ask Imam Mark your questions and let us know, inshallah. Jazakallah khair, Imam Mark, for coming. It's great for having you here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great.
You can find me on social media.
Yeah, so Facebook,
Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, pretty much everything. Yeah. Every form of bid'ah social media that you can think of, I think I'm on there.
Yeah, no, I know it's in the middle of your Sunday, so thank you so much, and thank you guys for watching. بسیار تشکر که پروگرام دیدین انشالله که دیگه هفته یک پروگرام خوب داشته باشیم که co-host Turabi. Thank you guys so much for watching. Inshallah, next week we will be on air with the co-host Turabi at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.